All right, I think we're live. And today I just wanted to talk a little bit about a very disturbing, to say the least, movie which was just released by Netflix. And I know there have been a lot of videos attacking their decision and describing the twisted mindset that led to this decision. There was a good video by Matt Walsh, which actually reviewed it was actually more repulsive than even its fiercest critics had been led to believe. The fact that no one, one of the defenses of this film was that no one had been able to view it. It was embargoed so that basically only the film critics could see it. And if you go to Rotten Tomatoes, I think it has a 90 something percent approval on the tomato meter. Hey, John. 90% approval on the tomato meter and 3% approval from general reviewers, which is ordinary people who have seen the film or have come across the film online and submitted negative reviews, which is somewhat telling. But one of the main defenses was the fact that only film critics could see it, and they used this as an opportunity to decry the Philistinism of ordinary people who might object to pedophilia being glorified on some very reasonable grounds. But now that the film is released, it turns out that it's actually a lot more repugnant than even people who simply glanced at the promotional material could discern for themselves. So there've been a lot of videos and online reactions to this, almost uniformly negative, with the exception of the media and Hollywood, which I don't want to get into this because it's not really the subject of the video, but Hollywood is a place where wickedness reigns and where you have to essentially compromise yourself and sell your body and your soul in order to succeed. And it's almost impossible to be a successful film or television star without succumbing to evil in one form or another. And one of the most pernicious forms is, of course, being sexually exploited. Particularly, this is an occurrence with minor children. And there was a film. There have actually been a couple of films. One of them, surprisingly, was the Hollywood studios prevented it from being released, but it was basically it was basically chronicling all of the pervasive nature of childhood sexual exploitation within Hollywood and within Los Angeles, and children being groomed. And you see this most prominently when you have very high profile, hi GW, very high profile directors or producers like Bryan Singer or Harvey Weinstein or Kevin Spacey, the homosexual actor in House of Cards, who, in order to escape, in, in order to escape criticism for his criminal, immoral behavior, he outed himself and disclosed that he was gay. But it's something that's rampant throughout Hollywood, and this was a film that actually interviewed people who were firsthand witnesses and victims of this process. So Hollywood, academia, and the media, the usual suspects, are praising this film, which is essentially a pro pedophile film masquerading as some sort of nuanced statement against childhood sexual exploitation. And I looked at the interview of the director. Now, the director, I didn't know this until hi Alejandro. I didn't know this until I actually did a bit of cursory research. But someone mentioned the fact that the director was Senegalese Muslim. Yeah, that's another good point. He probably was holding, because you're not going to be condemned in Hollywood for being gay, even if you're a promiscuous homosexual. You're not going to be condemned for that. So he wasn't withholding this in order to advance his career. It probably was simply a kind of a what do you call that? An ace in the hole, in case his criminal behavior was ever disclosed. He could kind of use this as a card to a varying degree of success. But yeah, so the director is a Senegalese Muslim, as someone on Twitter mentioned. So I actually did a little bit of investigation. And for those of you who aren't familiar, Senegal is 90% Muslim, its population. It's predominantly Sufi, so there are various Sufi orders and a small but significant Shia community. I think Hezbollah, they have a presence in West Africa, and Senegal is probably one of the countries uh, where they recruit potential future jihadists, and at the same time cultivate a minority sect. So it's mostly Sufi orders, but there's a small Shiite community. There's a very small Christian minority, somewhere between 4 and 5%, I believe. And the interesting aspect of this is that the woman's mother is apparently a devout Muslim. She veils herself, and she was actually criticizing her daughter for making this film, not presumably not because it offended her religious beliefs, but because she thought it would pose a potential threat to her from the Muslim community, which is ironic when you consider the fact that pedophilia and even pederasty is encouraged and sanctioned within Islam, particularly within the Quran. And I'll cite chapter and verse. There are several that promote this sort of behavior. But it wasn't. It was for because her mother feared a potential backlash against her from the Muslim community, which is very numerous and powerful in France. They're around 5% of the population, maybe a little bit more now, but they are a pivotal bloc that can unleash chaos, but can also be an influential voting bloc. And Francois Hollande, yeah, Kathy Young. I met Kathy Young at a Reason function, an event thrown jointly hosted by Reason and Spiked magazine. And yeah, she's kind of what you would call a lobitarian, or a losertarian, one of these people who just thinks who thinks libertinism and freedom are synonymous. So that's not too surprising. But but getting back to this film, it is kind of interesting, her background. So her mother veils herself. She is a devout Muslim. Someone said the director was Muslim, which I couldn't really discover. She, to the best of my knowledge, when I looked over this, she doesn't seem to be. If she's a Muslim, she's a nominal or cultural Muslim, um, which a significant minority or plurality of Muslims are, depending upon what country. I don't think it's 10%. I could be mistaken, but if Muslims were 10%, they would exert even more influence. they if it got to that point, I'm pretty sure Muslims would have cabinet, would have uh perhaps even a premier would be Muslim in France, or at least the heads of some of the major political parties, like uh the well Macron's party. I forget what the name of his party is, but they do exercise a lot of influence. Like I said, they actually put Francois Hollande over the top. He was elected because of Muslim support. But yeah, the director may be a nominal Muslim, and that's something you can do in Islam as long as you. And Theodore Dalrymple describes this a little bit in his one of his essays about specifically France, but the Muslim population. You can actually be a nominal Muslim. You can violate all sorts of Islamic principles, including some of the five pillars. But as long as there's no outward manifestation of your apostasy, as long as you're not eating pork, and this is a big one, for some reason, eating pork, even more so than some of the other restrictions, is frowned upon. So as long as you're not eating pork, and you occasionally you go when you gather with your family, you observe Eid and some of the Eid al-Adha and Eid al-Fitr. As long as you observe some of the major festivals, then the Muslims won't have that much of a problem with you, as long as you don't criticize Muhammad and you at least make a pretense of being a Muslim. So that could be the case with this woman. Even though she doesn't veil herself, she might be some sort of notional Muslim. Uh, but from what I can tell, she doesn't really subscribe to Islam. But one of the interesting things about when I was looking at this, one of the interesting things was her defense of this film, because of course, since she's the director, she's been going to the barricades to defend this film, and her defense uh, boils down to the fact that this is a critique of child sexual exploitation. But even if you go down deeper, and not a lot of YouTube commenters have brought this up, but what she says, and this is one of her interviews when she was promoting her film. I believe it was with the Guardian, but I could be mistaken. But she says, yes, Islam restricts what women can wear, and it restricts how they dress. But how is that any different from these sorts of prurient, disgusting forms of child exploitation in the West? And this is something you'll find a lot with Muslims. And um, I'll delve into this a little bit, but I don't disagree. I don't think anyone who's criticizing this disagrees with. I don't think anyone disagrees with the notion that the exaltation of child sexual abuse and pedophilia, which it has becoming more and more prevalent and more normalized. I don't think anyone who is I don't think I but people who have a beef with this film, they're not being inconsistent. That's basically my point. But you see this a lot with Muslims. In order to defend an indefensible belief system, they'll point to the cultural degradation of the West and the ethical erosion, the fact that we're no longer basing our society along sound moral principles, and we don't even have a real connection to the biblical roots of Western civilization, particularly in America, which was created for um, for Protestant nonconformists and people who wanted to establish um, a system of government that was more or less based on biblical principles. So you can there's no inconsistency between criticizing Islam and the way it views women as pieces of meat, and criticizing the current state of Western society and how it's very similar, in fact. And you'll if you do some research into this, you it's very similar to how the Roman Empire operated, particularly before before Christianity became ascendant. This idea that children, and you'll find this a recurring theme in Greek literature and Greek poetry, the abuse of young, particularly young boys, is something that's glorified. And this was one of the things that changed once the gospel started to be spread. Things like this started to change. As at the same time, just as at the same time, women's position and women's standing in society became started to change because of people learning, uh, people who were estranged from the Bible. It was being open to them. It was the gospel was being spread by people like the Apostle Paul. Just like that changed simultaneously the the view of children and how they were simply um, vessels to be exploited. That changed as well. So there's no inconsistency between denouncing child sexual exploitation and denouncing a religion that uh, it was founded on the principle of sexual exploitation. And that was one of the things, besides the fact that Islam itself is essentially a looting party masquerading as a religion. That was the proximate cause for Islam to be founded, was to find a moral justification for robbing and stealing from people. But sexual gratification was the second principle, but below that. And uh, I have a good friend, Keith Darrow, who's a campus evangelist. Who's a campus evangelist. So he goes around to different college campuses, and he obviously had to stop doing that for months because of COVID, but now he's restarting that ministry. But he has a great channel, by the way. He has a podcast called Campus Preacher Podcast. It's part of the Fight, Laugh, Feast Network, which I would recommend watching. But he also has a very fascinating YouTube channel. The name is Keith Darrow. That's the name of the channel. So if you want to, if you want to look at him, look at his work, you can go visit there. But he has a very salient point here when he says a lot of these Christians who apostatize, who fall away from Christ and fall away from the Bible. It's not universally true, but there's a strong presumption that the reason they did that is because they wanted to gratify their sexual desires. And this is true in a lot of cases. You can go back to a lot of these Christians that have fallen away and committed apostasy and left the church. Many times they will do it because they want to pursue, whether it's adultery or divorce or homosexuality, whatever it is, they want to participate in some some form of sexual gratification that's foreclosed to them if they continue to adhere to biblical principles. So Keith makes this point, which is a very salient point, and I think it's also applicable in this case in terms of Islam. Islam is an easy way for someone to pretend that they have, if not salvation, that they're at least on good terms with God or whom they perceive to be God, while at the same time indulging in their sexual fantasies and gratifying their sexual fantasies. And you see this all the time in the real world because it's based on certain Quranic principles. This is my copy of the Quran. It's in several pieces. I didn't desecrate this intentionally. This is just wear and tear, but I'm sure Muslims would consider it desecration, particularly the fact that, particularly the marginal notes, the marginalia, and the parts that I highlighted. But you can see this. This is a reflection of Islam. So many of you are probably familiar with this, but in Surah 43, and let me just see if I can find it. In verse 70, it says, "Enter the garden, you and your wives, you shall be made happy. There shall be sent round to them golden bowls and drinking cups. Therein shall be what your souls yearn after, and wherein the eyes shall delight, and you shall abide forever. You shall abide therein. And this is the garden which you are given as an inheritance on account of what you did. For you therein are many fruits of which you shall eat, since surely the guilty shall abide in the chastisement of hell." So this again, and I've talked about this before in my Quran series, the fact that what is something that Muhammad and his followers yearned after? It wasn't righteousness. It wasn't communion with the true God. It wasn't being absolved of sin. It was basically to have their sin sanctioned and to be able to indulge in their sin when they enter quote unquote paradise. That was their goal. So you have this with women, and this is one of the reasons that men are promised this endless supply of houris, these young women that they can use to satisfy their urges, that have no real agency of their own. But it's not just women. It's not just women who they are able to exploit. If you go to Surah 52, it says, starting in verse 21, in verse 20, it says, "Reclining on thrones set in lines, and we will unite them to large-eyed, beautiful ones. And as for those who believe in their offspring, follow them in faith. We will unite with them their offspring, and we will not diminish to them aught of their work. Every man is responsible for what he shall have wrought. And we will aid them with fruit and flesh, such as they desire. They shall pass therein from one to another, a cup wherein there shall be nothing vain nor any sin." So this goes to my point, and I've talked about this many times. I've talked about this repeatedly. The fact that there is no sin in Islamic paradise, but is there no sin because God is there and sin cannot exist? No, there's no sin because sin is laundered. So in other words, you're still sinning, but that sin is sanctified. So in other words, that's why you can drink wine in Islamic paradise, despite the fact that wine is forbidden, and that's why you can engage in these activities, even though on earth Islam is one of the most, if not the most, carnal religions there is. So there's nothing vain or sin. That's because vanity and sin is being laundered, essentially. You're not being cleansed of sin. Sin is not being expurgated. It's being laundered. So you can still sin, but it's okay because Allah has said it's okay because you're a Muslim and you prostrate yourself to Allah and to Muhammad. "And around them shall go boys," and this is the key section, "of theirs, if they were hidden pearls, and some of them shall advance towards others, questioning each other, saying, Surely we feared before on account of our families. but Allah has been gracious to us and He has saved us from the punishment of the hot wind. So here you have essentially bachabazi. For those of you not familiar, that's a term for dancing boys, the dancing boys. You see this particularly in Afghanistan as well as Pakistan. Young boys who were sexually exploited and groomed by older men. You saw this before the Taliban under the Mujahideen, and you also see it with the Taliban now. It's a cultural, it's a Pashtun custom, but it's even more widespread than that. And there have been documentaries about this. Yeah, it's disgusting. It's hideous. But that's something that Islam sanctions. And this is something. That's not just the only verse. There are at least 3 verses where pederasty is encouraged, and pederasty is something that will take place in paradise. Now, imagine how twisted that paradise will be when you see a description of heaven in the Bible, whether it's in the prophecies of Ezekiel or the revelation of St. John, or in the Pauline epistles, when Paul describes his own experience being translated and seeing heaven for himself. You don't see any of this. You don't see sin. You don't see women or young women, much less girls, much less young boys being sexually exploited. Hi, Christine. I'm glad you're here. Hi, Travis. You don't see young girls and young boys being exploited. Yeah, Marcus, I was actually talking about that a few minutes ago. It's very reminiscent, and a lot of things, because Islam is essentially a pagan religion. It's very reminiscent of what you see in ancient Greece. This idea of grooming young boys, and you see it more with young girls, particularly in the West. In places like the UK, you have hundreds of Muslim grooming gangs, particularly specifically Pakistani Muslim grooming gangs. But you also see the exploitation of young boys. You see this in Afghanistan and Pakistan. Like I said, the bachabazi. This is something that's still going on because it's something that's encouraged and exalted even in the Quran, which is what Muslims base their lives around. They see Muhammad as the perfect man worthy of emulation. So that's one of the reasons why this idea that you can't consistently criticize Islam and the cultural decadence of the West. It's kind of a ridiculous. It's a ridiculous argument. I think there's a lot more similarities and a lot more commonalities between the two than there are differences. And getting back to my point earlier, when I mentioned Keith Darrow and his explanation for the apostasy that you see, particularly among church leaders, very often, and you see this a lot. I think Kent Hovind, even though he's not, even though obviously there are many Christians who don't were never followers of his. I think he also got divorced in order to marry a younger woman. So you see people trying to find some sort of loophole in order to satisfy their own desires and what they were desiring to do anyway. So Keith's point is relevant also to the other side, what you see in the secular world, that particularly this push to legalize pedophilia and legalize pederasty. I think I mentioned this in an earlier video, but Scott Wiener's an assemblyman in California whose sole purpose is simply to be able to enact laws where he'll be able to indulge in his own to gratify his own lusts. So he passed a law decriminalizing or very close to decriminalizing knowingly giving someone HIV. This is a man who takes Prep C, which is a drug for gay men who like to engage in promiscuous sex. It prevents them from contracting HIV. So he passed a law where transmitting HIV is no longer a felony. Now he helped to enact a law where sexually abusing a minor, if you're gay, is now essentially legal. It's been legalized. So if you're 24 years old, you can commit statutory rape with a 14-year-old boy, an adolescent, and that would now be legal in California. I think it's on Governor Newsom's desk, but I'm not sure if he's signed it or not. But this is something you see. Keith's principle is applicable in the secular world as well, and you can see it with the political drive to enact these things. These laws are not being presented as a way for people who are wicked to indulge in their lust. They're being presented as a form of equity or egalitarianism. And this is something that started in the 1960s. And here I'll give credit to the Senegalese director. She made a somewhat good point, even though her conclusion was horribly awry. She made the point that this is something that's prevalent in France, this sort of childhood sexual exploitation. And one of the reasons is because France, the culture beginning in the 1960s, started to promote this sort of debauchery. And there are many instances of this. There was an author, Gabriel Metznaf, who wrote books. He wrote quote-unquote novels where he described engaging in sex tourism and abusing young children, specifically young girls, and even raping young women, young girls in France itself. And this is someone who is lauded, and he wasn't even condemned until the Me Too movement took off in France. And this man is no different from Tariq Ramadan, whose grandfather was a leader in the Muslim Brotherhood and is a devout Muslim and is one of the main Islamic thinkers. He's essentially a rapist. He invited Muslim women, some of them wearing a headscarf, to his hotel room and then proceeded to rape them. So they're identical. They're both living in France. One is a native Frenchman, and the other is a Muslim, but whose parents I think are Egyptian. But they basically have the same approach, the same view of sexuality, which is not a biblical view at all. In France, you see it. The founder of the Green Party, Daniel Cohn-Bendit, he's originally from Germany, but he settled in France, and he was also a very open pedophile. And there were no repercussions to that because the Green Party and so many of these political activists had changed the culture and deformed it to such a point that childhood sexual exploitation was something that was viewed nonchalantly. And these people, when they were staging an insurrection in 1968, revolting, attacking campuses, holding campuses hostage, they were promoting it as this political transformation. We were doing away with this post-war fascist regime, even though all of these countries were democratic, liberal, political, democratic liberal governments. They were presenting them as fascists who were trying to control young students and young people. And that was the patina which was put over a movement intended to exploit children and to foment chaos. And you see a lot of similarities to what's happening now in the United States. Anyway, I just wanted to talk about that a little bit. I figured I would make a video coming at it from a slightly different perspective. I'm glad all of you who came, Marcus, Enzo, John, Alejandro, all of the mods, Travis, um, anyone else. I can't see anyone else, but I'm glad all of you came and joined me today, and I will talk to you later. Bye.